My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Good morning in Washington, good afternoon in Europe, and good evening in Central Asia. We have a wonderful event for you today on Nukus, the reforms in Uzbekistan, and US-Uzbek relations. To conduct this conversation, we have the Uzbekistan ambassador to Washington, Yavlon Vahabov. We have Brian Stimmel, who's director of the Office of Central Asian Affairs at the US State Department. And we have Dr. Jennifer Murtashvili, who's an associate professor at the University of Pittsburgh Center for Governance and Markets, and a longtime expert on Central Asia. We'll also have a special guest who I will introduce later. We will start by offering Ambassador Vahabov a chance to talk about what happened in Nukus at the beginning of the month. And please, Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Herbst, for giving me this opportunity to speak and shed the light on what really happened in Karakalpakstan and tell about our efforts, how we are handling this crisis in line with our international obligations. Of course, we're deeply saddened by these tragic events that happened in that part of the country and took the lives of civilians and law enforcement officers. And these days, our thoughts and sympathies are with their close ones. Actually, no one can ever predict that such tragedies could have happened in Uzbekistan. There were no prerequisites for such protests. The demonstrations that started peacefully, reacting to the draft amendments to the constitution related to the status of these autonomous region of Uzbekistan, were hijacked by a criminal group that committed grave offenses on July the 1st, the 2nd in Nukus. And the atrocities these groups perpetrated have demonstrated their vivid criminal purposes to split the society, incite inter-ethnic hatred between Karakalpaks and Uzbeks, overthrow the local government and undermine Uzbekistan's territorial integrity. So currently the situation in that part of the country is calm and quiet. Mobile communications are fully operational on the territory of Karakalpakstan. Public and social facilities continue to serve as usual. Karakalpakstan is returning to normal. The relevant state bodies of Uzbekistan have been sharing with the public on a regular basis updates on what the government is doing to address the people's needs in Karakalpakstan. Last week, I've met with several human rights advocates from Human Rights Watch, Freedom House, Amnesty International, and Freedom Now. And we've heard their concerns and recommendations. And I would like to stress that peaceful voices will always be heard. And the president's swift call to leave the constitutional provisions on the status of Karakalpakstan unchanged is a true testament of this approach. However, those responsible for committing crimes, including for the use of excessive and disproportionate force, will be fully held accountable, regardless of perpetrators' rankings and positions. At the same time, individual protesters engaged in violence will be subjected to a fair and transparent judicial process to hold them accountable for their actions. As my president reiterated recently, Uzbekistan is committed to pursuing investigations into the violence in a full, credible, impartial, and very transparent manner, consistent with international norms and best practices. And the president made it clear that all civil society members of the parliament, and the human rights activists will be involved in this process. The investigation is still going on. However, journalists, including foreign media like EuroAsiaNet, who were reporting while being on the ground in Nukus, have confirmed that none of the deaths and injuries were caused by live ammunition. And we would like to emphasize that no forces can prevent the Republic of Uzbekistan from consistently continuing the course of democratic reforms. President Mirziyoyev from day one in his office has been pursuing people's-centric policy and continues to promote human honor and dignity as the first and foremost priority for any development strategies. And we will remain committed to the best interests of our people. And I'm grateful to our partners here in the United States and across the globe for unwavering support of Uzbekistan's democratic reforms, my country's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Thank you, Ambassador.
Oops, I spoke without unmuting myself. Ambassador, thank you very much. Brian Stimler, over to you for the view from the State Department.
Thank you, Ambassador Herbst, for very much for this opportunity to join today's discussion at this important moment in the U.S. bilateral relationship with Uzbekistan. You know, in March, we celebrated 30 years of diplomatic relations between our two countries. To mark that occasion, Secretary Blinken was pleased to welcome then Foreign Minister Kamilov to Washington. Since then, that is in just the last few months, we've hosted several high-level visitors from Uzbekistan, including Deputy Prime Minister Umurzakov, Minister of Information and Communication Technologies Shermatov, Senator Safoyev and Senator Narbayeva, and I think this demonstrates the breadth of our bilateral cooperation. Uzbekistan has become an increasingly dynamic and constructive player in the Central Asia region. It's clear that the relationship between Washington and Tashkent has implications that extend far beyond our bilateral agenda. For instance, Uzbekistan's strong support for the C5+1 regional diplomatic platform reflects our shared understanding that Central Asia's future development and security are cross-border and international in scope. Through the relationships we've established with both the government and people of Uzbekistan over the past 3 decades, the United States has worked to boost economic prosperity, strengthen security, and promote respect for human rights and democratic governance. At the core of the relationship is the United States' unwavering support for Uzbekistan's political independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. And I want to speak for just a moment more about these principles. Indeed, Russia's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine has come at a terrible human cost, while violating these same international principles of sovereign equality and territorial integrity. Principles that undergird the UN Charter and modern world order, which exists to ensure that militarily powerful countries such as Russia don't impose their will on other sovereign states simply because they've decided those other states have no right to make their own decisions or even to exist. The United States, as you know, has prioritized the use of sanctions against Russia and its enablers in response to its unjustified war against Ukraine. US sanctions packages are specifically designed to minimize negative impacts, negative impacts on allies and partners, including Central Asian countries such as Uzbekistan. We are working very closely with our Central Asian partners to ensure they have the information and tools that they need to cooperate with these international measures. In light of today's topic, I'd also like to share a few thoughts about democratic governance. We welcomed the government of Uzbekistan's broad-based program of political, economic, and social reforms launched in 2016. And we continue to emphasize the importance of fully implementing efforts that advance respect for human rights, foster democratic governance, and promote equitable economic growth. It is important to continually revitalize that difficult but important work. Uzbekistan has made significant progress modernizing its economy, including by ending the systematic practice of forced labor in the cotton harvest. The Department of State wholeheartedly endorses the Cotton Campaign's decision earlier this year to end the Cotton Pledge. Think about it. Few people in 2015 would have imagined that Uzbekistan would now be in a position to become a major source country for global cotton supply chains. Much remains to be done, though, to ensure similar gains in areas of democratic governance, the rule of law, and protections for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Such gains are particularly important given the constitutional reform process now underway in Uzbekistan. For any reforms to be credible, the government of Uzbekistan must ensure respect for political pluralism and the important role of civil society and an independent press. And it must gain broad-based public support for constitutional changes. You've likely seen our public statement in response to the outbreak of violence in Karakol, Pakistan earlier this month. We urge all parties to eschew violence and to resolve disagreements through peaceful dialogue. While we note that President Mirziyoyev has asked that the proposed changes to Karakol, Pakistan's status be dropped from the package of draft constitutional amendments, we continue to urge Uzbekistani authorities to pursue a full, credible, and transparent investigation into the violence in a manner consistent with international human rights law obligations and commitments. In closing, I want to echo remarks made by US Ambassador to Uzbekistan, Daniel Rosenblum, during our embassy's recent Independence Day celebration. He said, "Independence and sovereignty are not enough. Freedom and good government are also necessary elements of nationhood. The United States remains committed to a partnership with Uzbekistan that protects and honors these values, and will continue to support the Uzbekistani government and its people as they work toward a future that unlocks their country's full potential." Thank you.
Brian, thank you very much. And unfortunately, Brian has to leave now, so he'll not be joining the discussion that follows. We turn now to Professor Mirtashvili, who was recently in Tashkent. Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's so with the heavy heart that we're here today talking about the events in Karakol, Pakistan, which I think are the most significant test, is the most significant test of the Mirziyoyev government since he has come to power. And how Uzbekistan reacts to this, not just today, not just in the past week, but in the months and years to come, will play an important role in defining the country's future. And I can't underscore how significant this is. I was in Tashkent when the constitutional reforms were announced, and most of the changes were quite predictable. The one change that got the most attention, however, was the one about Karakol, Pakistan. And this was because many of the other reforms, such as the ability for President Mirziyoyev to stay in power for 2 more terms, had already been discussed publicly by government officials. So immediately after these amendments were offered, they garnered significant attention, and local media outlets highlighted them. And it was a bit shocking to see this because it was unclear what those reforms were trying to solve, what problems they were trying to solve. So since coming to power, President Mirziyoyev has made Karakol, Pakistan a priority. He's visited the country, the region numerous times. He's increased investment in the region. He's given the region a lot of attention that it did not receive under the previous government. But the changes to the status of Karakol, Pakistan was truly an unforced error because it didn't seem to take account the views of the people of the region. And I think for many, that calls into question the entire constitutional reform process. After the unrest began, Mirziyoyev moved quickly to reverse course. But it's not clear how longer-term problems of citizen participation and citizen engagement can be solved. Local journalists have complained that many of the president's initiatives to create greater opportunities for civic engagement and participation have closed in recent years. Many complain of greater censorship of media and that portals that were intended for citizen engagement no longer function as they did during the early years of reform. And this was before these events in recent weeks. President Mirziyoyev has made several promises that were unprompted and came from within. And that is what made the reform process in Uzbekistan truly special, that these reforms were not the outcome of external pressure, but his own initiative. Upon coming to power, he talked openly of open elections, greater deconcentration, and even decentralization of power. He often spoke quite publicly about election of local governors and local officials, which have always been appointed by the president. In the past year, Mirziyoyev seems to have reversed track on many of these promises, and the constitutional reform process seemed to replicate moves we had seen by previous governments who tried to do much of the same. So the unrest that we have seen should also be seen in this light. And my sense is that many in Uzbekistan will be looking to the country's leaders to see how it makes good on the promises it had already made to its own citizens. What makes Uzbekistan's reforms important is because they have been initiated on the inside and not proposed by outsiders. Mirziyoyev has offered himself as an alternative to the past. Upon coming to power, he promised sweeping judicial reforms, an end to torture, and a more open economy and society. And as Ambassador Herbst noted, we have seen enormous progress on many of these counts. His reform agenda was both an explicit and an implicit contrast to that of his predecessor, Islam Karimov. In particular, it was Karimov's reaction to the Andijan uprising in 2005 that left 187 dead by official accounts, and independent groups have far higher figures. The aftermath of the Andijan uprising illustrate why many people are concerned about this. It has been difficult to know what's been going on in Karakalpakstan. Many have reported that the internet has been shut down and continues to be shut down. Several prominent journalists and civic leaders have been arrested and charged with crimes against public safety. Prominent journalist Dalit Murad Tajmuradov has been charged with a conspiracy to overthrow the constitutional order. Lalagul Kalikhanova was charged with crimes against public safety. Uzbekistan has an important place in my heart, and I think in the hearts of many who are watching this presentation today. And I think as we go forward, we're going to look to whether Uzbekistan chooses a new path or to see whether it looks inward. And I don't think we'll know the answer to this immediately, but the reason why we're looking at this in the ways that we are is because of the past. The past is difficult to untangle oneself from. And the choices that Uzbekistan makes in these coming days and weeks could shape a generation for the future. Thank you.
Jennifer, thank you. I will now ask our participants some questions, and we'll then have time a little bit later for audience questions. So Ambassador Habov, let me start with you. President Mirziyoyev has spoken since day one of moving the country forward, and Jennifer went into that some. The new constitution is one of the most important features of this. What impact, if any, will the event in Nukus have on the reform process in Uzbekistan? And Jennifer gave you her thoughts on that. And what will be the impact of the new constitution? And let me just add that, underscore the point that Jennifer just made. Because of the country's past, the things we saw with the regime, the government's response to the unrest raises some questions. So how does this all work in your mind?
Thank you, Ambassador, for this question. President Shavkat Mirziyoyev outlined that human honor and dignity values and the person-society state approach will be the basis of ongoing constitutional reforms in Uzbekistan. And in fact, this stands behind of the constitutional reforms in the country, and the government would not stray from that principle. So no one should doubt that the president's strong political will to advance further the democratic reforms and protect all fundamental rights. However, I would like to emphasize that the constitutional reform is a gradual process, and one shouldn't come to wrong conclusions that all suggested constitutional amendments are final and are not subject to any appeal. From very beginning, all these changes were published for public review and could be dropped if our people deem them inappropriate or premature. Draft constitutional law will be amended and finalized based on the proposals and opinions of the people of Uzbekistan. In the meantime, Ambassador, we all live in a very fragile and unpredictable geopolitical environment, and we sought to strengthen our territorial integrity against any future challenges when we introduced some amendments. And we admit that we failed and miscalculated to examine public attitudes to these constitutional changes on the status of Karakalpakstan beforehand, and thought that the amendments are reflecting the voices of all Karakalpak people. But we have learned the lessons. All other draft amendments now could be reconsidered. And with this unrest in Karakalpakstan, some may overlooked the priorities of constitutional reforms outlined by President Mirziyoyev. So the first priority upholds a person's life, freedom, and dignity, so rights and interests. So the second consolidates the idea of Uzbekistan as a social welfare state. So the concept, by the way, that laid the foundation for American policy, starting from President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs, aimed at establishing the state of inclusive society that protects and promotes the economic and social well-being of its citizens, based upon the principles of equal opportunity and equitable distribution of wealth. And the third actually clearly defines the state's body's responsibilities, while the fourth focuses on improving public administration and strengthening democracy. And you know, Ambassador, I'm very confident that the new constitution that reflects the voices of our people will further strengthen the guarantees of protection of human rights, their freedoms, honor and dignity, ensure openness, more transparency and accountability of state authorities, and improve the democratic system of check and balances. That would be my answer to these questions you raised.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador. Jennifer, I'd like to turn over to you. You explained why what happens next is very important in regards to the incidents in Nukus and the impact on what happens further in Uzbekistan. But you also mentioned the progress we've seen in recent years. And I know you helped organize a conference of the Central Eurasian Studies Society in Tashkent this summer. I think it would be interesting for our audience to hear about that conference, how it happened, and what you think its meaning is in terms of evolution in Uzbekistan.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about the conference. And unfortunately, I think the great success of that conference was overshadowed by these events in Nukus, unfortunately. And it made very difficult for us to really celebrate the enormous success of that conference. And I should say that we do have Ambassador Vahabov to thank for those successes that we have. He was an extraordinary advocate for this conference, which brought over 300 scholars from around the world, and especially from Central Asia itself, to present research. This was the first time that Uzbekistan had seen an independent, truly independent academic conference that an international academic conference that where the agenda was set entirely by the organizers, through double-blind peer review process, and anything went at that conference. And you will find, if you look at the conference schedule, we had many panels on very diverse topics, including things that I think hadn't been discussed in Uzbekistan before in very open manners. So it was really historic. And people were really quite overjoyed to see this finally take place in Uzbekistan. And it was something that we had been working on for a long time. But I should say that, about the protests, about why they're significant and why there's concern right now about this. I think for many of us who care deeply about Uzbekistan, is because there's nothing special about protests right now. Every country in the world is experiencing unprecedented levels of protest. Uzbekistan is not unique in that case. And my colleagues at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace have maintained a global protest tracker. And you can see that protests are lighting the world on fire right now. The key question, I think, for Uzbekistan is how it responds to these protests. I think Uzbekistan should probably brace itself for more. But it's the violence in protests. Every country sees protests, but not every country sees heavy levels of repression in response to them. And so the question is how the country will deal with this, I think will define the country, not only in the eyes of its citizens, but the eyes of the world in the years to come.
Okay. Jennifer, thank you very much. I mentioned at the top that we have a special visitor with us today. It's a name I think known to many in our audience, Bahor Imamova of Voice of America, Radio for Europe, and she was in Uzbekistan very recently. So Bahor, I'd be very interested in your take on what happened to Nukus and the meaning of it overall for the development of the country.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Herbst. It's wonderful to join this session. You know, during the pandemic and since the pandemic, we have been these passive observers as journalists. We sit here, we listen to everybody, and we drop our questions, texting. So it's really nice for you to call on me and seek my input. I'll be more than happy to, share my thoughts. Of course, I have tons of questions to our speakers. Actually, Ambassador Vahabov already answered one of my upcoming questions, but I'm going to just, I think I'm going to throw in some thoughts and hope that both Ambassador Vahabov and Jennifer Murtazashvili will share their thoughts on those issues as well. A lot has changed in Uzbekistan and a lot has not. So, and I think the conflict, the unrest in Pakistan says volumes about that. Nothing is white and black. The more we're, learning, the more we're exploring about what really happened, and we haven't been to Pakistan yet, we are realizing that things are more complicated than we imagined, and that there are they were peaceful protesters, and they were, what the government has been calling criminals. They were journalists and activists there. But what we know for sure is that thousands came out in Nukus. Thousands, something that we never imagined would happen in Uzbekistan. And I can't, I was listening to Jennifer when she mentioned about how typical the protests are now around the world. But, Uzbekistan hadn't really been part of that for a very long time. The last time we saw people coming out was in 2005 in Andijan, and we all know what happened there. So, never say never, right? I mean, that's what we've been hearing from a lot of Uzbeks. So people in Uzbekistan, even in Uzbekistan, apparently can come out. And we also saw how what really, shocked me in many ways was on July 1st, when we were getting all these social media videos about what was happening in Nukus, we saw the security forces, we saw the police, internal affairs officers standing there trying to control the crowd without necessarily, at least in some of these videos, using force. So that was actually, that was very puzzling for me. It's like, wow, look at them. They're actually not, rushing to use force. But then later we also saw that they were indeed using force. So, there is a lot there to analyze. And, eventually I think we will end up somewhere where we think we will know the truth. But in most of these, unrest cases, you have this ongoing debates forever, right? I mean, nobody really can agree on who's right and who was wrong, and I think the debate will continue forever. But just in terms of what has changed in the country, very quickly, I would say that President Mirziyoyev has been more successful abroad than at home. Uzbekistan has a very proactive diplomacy now. It doesn't really have any outstanding major issues with the world. It has a good, much better relations with the international community, international organizations. It has dramatically better relations with its neighbors. And we have seen the effect of that in the aftermath of these events in Pakistan. And secondly, Uzbekistan is still more transparent than it was in 5 years ago. We have seen several steps backward since the pandemic, but in general, I think the country is still open for business. It's open for change in many ways, but there is this duality that constantly sort of is felt both locally and centrally in Tashkent, and in the regions. On one hand, you have this force, still quite strong, I would say, in the government, in the system, which wants to reform, which wants to change structurally, which wants better governance, which wants to offer better government services. And then there is this very strong contingent within the system, which is incredibly cautious, says, no, we have to be careful. We have to control everything. We have to control the dose of freedom we give to the people, whether it's media freedom, religious freedom, or political freedom. So they're constantly cautioning and trying to manage, tightly manage that space. Third, of course, Uzbekistan is open for business and they're doing their best to attract investment. And there's constant talk about how to improve the Uzbekistan's business climate. But you have deep corruption, you have predatory and nepotistic ways of doing businesses and lack of rule of law, schemed briberies. And, we hear about that all the time. And many actually argue that the level of corruption increased under President Mirziyoyev, expanded under President Mirziyoyev. There is a lot of conversation about anti-corruption efforts in Uzbekistan, but somehow the government, based on everything we know, has not been able to, control this. And fourth, of course, Uzbekistan is, the government says it's fully committed to its reform agenda. It says it's expanding this agenda, but it spends a lot of more energy and resources, I would argue, based on what I have seen, to promote that agenda than to execute it, than focus on the process. So a lot of people by now, they know that reforms are very difficult in Uzbekistan, and people realize that, these roadmaps don't necessarily work, but there is also this deep realization that it's more propaganda than substance. And I think that's also hurting the credibility of the system. And fifth point, and I'll make it this very quickly, and this is very critical, I think, the Uzbek citizenry, despite all of these issues, and we also saw this in Pakistan, is more emboldened than ever. Despite the pressure, despite harassments, despite all kinds of issues, with limited freedom or relative freedom, right? We can argue. Uzbeks are more critical, openly critical of the establishment, of the elite, of those in power, of the issues of the state of the society than ever. And with these discussions of constitutional reforms, thousands have actually provided feedback to the government, and they have come up with their own proposals and ideas. And we cannot underestimate these bulk of, sort of input by the citizens. And again, Pakistan events reflect that. And what we see in these, feedbacks is that those strong supporters of Mirziyoyev, and based on my own reporting and, our report coverage of the election campaigns, elections, and then the travels around the country, we know that President Mirziyoyev enjoys huge respect, trust. I would also argue he's very popular around the country. But right now, what we hear from the people is that they want proper transition of power, proper transition of leadership in Uzbekistan. They're kind of expecting something from President Mirziyoyev. They want him to turn into this democratic leader that Uzbekistan has never seen. They want him to finish his second term, hand it over to the next guy, and this push now to zero his 2 terms in 2016, because Uzbekistan will have a new constitution, because the presidential term will be extended from 5 years to 7, which would ensure President Mirziyoyev to stay in power all the way until 2040. I think that is, again, based on our assessment, based on what we hear from the people, that is going to deeply disappoint Mirziyoyev's support group, which we estimate to be the majority, because they don't want him to do that. And if you read Uzbek social media, it's written all over it. They don't want President Mirziyoyev to do that. They want him to be a different kind of a leader. So that, to me, poses the biggest test and the biggest risk for President Mirziyoyev. Does he want to overshadow his 10 years of work by going further, by disappointing his political sort of support, within the country, and and overshadowing the credibility and image that has been earned all these years. So this is something that we'll be watching. And I think that's where the country is right now. And this is why probably the government, not probably, definitely, should be really, really listening closely to what the public has been saying. Again, I have questions, but I would definitely hope that our speakers would respond to some of the issues that I raised here. That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, Navbahor, thank you very much. I'm going to ask a couple more questions. I see we already have some questions in the queue, which I will then take from the audience. So Ambassador Vahabov, I wanted to ask you about the US-Uzbek relationship, but before that, if you want to comment on what you heard from Jennifer or Navbahor, I'm all ears. I'm sure our audience is all ears too. But you first may want to unmute. Thank you.
Ambassador, I'll be so more than happy to do this.
Okay.
Again, I'm not going to argue with the panelists, but a few comments on what I've heard from both of them. As I said before, so this constitutional reform is still going on, and the final decision hasn't been made yet. So we are looking forward to the referendum, where this kind of decision will be made in our understanding. But in the meantime, I would like to stress that that amendment to extend the presidential terms is quite overemphasized. So the constitutional reforms are not only about presidential term, and however, so without exaggeration, it must be also recognized that nowadays President Shavkat Mirziyoyev's name, so associated with wide-scale drastic reforms that enabled significant improvements in ensuring human rights in the country, with strengthening government transparency and accountability and public oversight as well, with economic liberalization and privatization that, of course, you might argue as well, boosting trade and investments, in particular in doing commerce with our immediate neighbors. So with ending long-standing policy of isolation by policy of openness and good neighborliness, that I believe none of those panelists who are joining us today so can deny so these facts. And of course, with stability in Central Asia and increased level of trust among the countries of the region, and a strong will so to be well integrated and interconnected. And since he assumed so the presidency, so the country has charted a policy with an aim to build a stable, just and prosperous and democratic state. And all the achievements of the past 5 years, as I said before, are undeniable. And if being completely honest, so to ourselves, it also should be recognized that currently there is no alternative political figure with the same level of credibility and trust and the ability to achieve the aspirations of our people. And moreover, so many present-day crises such as COVID, so ongoing conflicts, so in our immediate neighborhood and beyond, so would require consistency of political will and continuity of reforms that could be maintained if the president has the opportunity to continue leading these efforts.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to comment on the US-Uzbek relationship?
Sure, absolutely. Ambassador, fundamentally our relations are based on mutual trust and understanding. So shared priorities for security and stability, so protection of human rights, adherence to democratic principles and the rule of law. And most importantly, so the US stands firm in its commitment to support our independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I would like to emphasize that our relations have withstood so the test of time, and since 2016 has grown substantially across all areas of our bilaterals and regional collaboration. And it is well institutionalized, I would say. It enjoys bipartisan support, and I believe cannot be drastically affected by the external context or by such domestic developments. And with changing dynamics in the region, Ambassador, many emerging opportunities and untapped potential, I believe that the United States could move beyond its traditional realms and pursue so much more proactive foreign policy. So that promotes partnerships primarily in trade investment, science and technology, education and capacity building, so as well as the cooperation within international financial institutions. And we firmly believe that the United States engagement in fostering economic interconnectivity and growth, Uzbekistan and other countries of the region will be able to strengthen resilience to many challenges and ensure prosperity of our people.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer, we heard from Brian Stimler the U.S. view on the bilateral relationship. In your judgment, is Washington doing enough to advance its interest in Uzbekistan and Central Asia? And what else should it be doing?
I think that it's been heartening to see increased cooperation between Uzbekistan and the United States over the past several years. But I don't think the strategy has been as effective as it could be, just because the United States has always seen Uzbekistan, especially in the past 20 years, as an afterthought to its Afghanistan strategy. Now that Afghanistan, the situation has changed drastically in Afghanistan, Uzbekistan becomes more important for the United States. But I don't think that working on twin pillars of security cooperation and democracy promotion necessarily go hand in hand with one another. I actually think Ambassador Vahabov has articulated here a very important way the United States can be involved through trade, through investment, through education, through science and technology. I think this is a much more creative approach, regional integration, a much more positive sum approach for the entire region that Washington should be much more involved in. However, that strategy that Ambassador Vahabov has just so clearly articulated, I think, is under enormous threat, the possibility of that, because of these events. And that's why I want to stress again how very serious this is, that the constitutional reforms look like a return to the past for many. Navbahor has indicated how that is interpreted internally, and I would also suggest that is the way it is being seen externally as well. And that is why these protests and the violence that Karakalpakstan has seen seem to many to be a return to the past. And immediate reactions included closing of borders, shutting off the internet in the region. And that is not going to augur well for a strategy that is focused on improving external relations, improving relations with neighbors. So that is why this moment is so important, how the government reacts to all of this. And, is there more than one person who could steer Uzbekistan into the future? I think that's for the people of Uzbekistan to decide who can steer them into the future. And if a constitutional reform makes it much more likely that a single individual is going to be doing that for many years to come, I think many in the country will see that with great disappointment. And this is actually a great risk to Uzbekistan's future stability. I know that many in the inside see this as a path to stability, but I think for many, it could lead to a path to greater instability because of what seem to be broken promises and an inability to live up to many things that were promised to people.
Thank you. But let me just follow up. You're very passionate about the need to address what seems to be a step backwards with the handling of this. Do you think the U.S. position on this specific point is what it should be, or how do you see it?
Well, has the U.S. called for an independent investigation into this? I haven't heard that yet. Have you?
Fair point. Okay.
Okay. So it's a question. Where should U.S. strategy be? It seems we've seen similar things happen. A very different situation actually in neighboring Tajikistan, and not much said about what happened in Gorno-Badakhshan. So I think it is a question. Have we seen, the government of Uzbekistan seems, Ambassador Vahabov has met with so many prominent human rights organizations, and I'll be curious to see if any of them will be invited to undertake independent investigations. But I haven't seen the United States call for one.
All right, thank you. All right, we
Correct
have,
me if I'm wrong.
okay, we have a number of questions in the queue from our audience. The first one's a very sensitive one. From Mr. Ajikhan Akhmetov for Ambassador Vahabov. And he says he considers this a moment de la veritas for our leadership, the Uzbek leadership, presumably, that 18 people lost their lives because someone failed to assess the situation with amendments regarding Karakalpakstan. So his question is, and again, I'm saying it's a sensitive one, might there be any personnel changes at senior leadership in Tashkent as a result of this?
So, as I said before, Ambassador, so the investigation is still going on. And as my president has reiterated, all perpetrators, regardless of their rankings and positions, especially those who might use this excessive or disproportional force against the protesters, so will be held accountable and brought into justice.
Okay.
There shouldn't be any doubt in these terms, and we've seen first change in the government, and I believe there will be more to come.
Thank you. All right, we have an anonymous question, which is not quite as sensitive as that, but still I think analytically very important. Does the violence in Nukus indicate a lack of reforms in the state's response to protest, or a disconnect between the reforms in Tashkent and how slow they are to filter through the bureaucracy? So, Imamor, I'll give you a chance to answer that, and we'll see if the others want to chip in.
I would honestly, I would rather hear from Ambassador Vahabov or Jen on this, because I think I've already, spoken about this. The overwhelmed, let me actually put the camera on, sorry.
Yes, we do want to see you. Not just hear you.
Our assessment, based on what we hear from the people of Uzbekistan there and from here, is that people see reforms, at least at this point, in the reform period, they see them more as propaganda than substantial steps. A lot of things have changed in the system structurally. One good example would be improvement in terms of providing the government services for the Uzbek people. So you see clear improvements there. But overall, I think it says volumes about where the government is, the gap between the people and the government, lack of trust still, lack of respect, and lack of rule of law. So in many ways, I think the lack of reforms and the state's response to protest, Karakalpaks are part of Uzbekistan. They have, and when we're covering these issues now, a lot of people are very quick to remind us that, hey, I am in Samarkand, or I'm in Bukhara, or I'm in Khorazm, I'm in Tashkent region, right next to the capital, and we suffer from these issues as well. We have environmental problems in our regions. We have economic, crisis, certain economic crisis in our area as well. So if you were to look for grievances that, Karakalpaks talk about, then you find them all across the country. And one blogger that I recently have been following said something I think which is very interesting about where the society is right now. His argument is that we've never really known of political freedom in Uzbekistan, and we've always been pressured as citizens. But imagine for Karakalpaks, this has been an ethnic as well. So it's not just civilian or, you feel as an Uzbek citizen. On top of that, they also take it as something ethnic. They take it as an ethnic discrimination. And if you were to go from region to region, I think you would hear similar grievances. So yes, I would argue that people feel that the reforms, whatever reforms have been pushed so far, have not really taken care of their basic grievances and problems.
Thank you. I know we do have a very smart audience, and Keely Bakken has put in the chat that in fact the U.S. government has called for an investigation and hopefully provided a link. So that has been answered. All right, we have another question from anonymous attendee.
Can I actually just respond to that, to what Nabor said?
Sure,
If that's
go
okay.
ahead.
What does this illustrate about something changing? I think Joanna Lillis, I don't know if she's watching, but her reporting on this was tremendous. And she was able to capture quite a lot. And she did note that there was violence on both sides of this. But I think we probably saw less violence than we would have seen had this situation occurred 10 years ago. But there's such a danger coming out of this in terms of how this is handled, not just for all the reasons I've underscored, but one of the things I'm also noticing on social media, on Uzbek social media, is an incredible outpouring of Uzbek nationalism, really targeted at Karakalpaks. And it is ugly. The Karakalpaks are a very small group, and they are being treated like traitors, for many of them expressing ideas that are actually guaranteed to them according to the Constitution, right? So the right to secession is in the Constitution. There's a long history here of promises made to the people of Karakalpakstan. They were supposed to have a referendum on independence about a decade ago that was promised to them by President Karimov. That never happened. But as a consequence of this, without greater, more channels for participation, it's going to be very difficult to contain this poison once it's unleashed. And it is really quite ugly. To see how Karakalpaks are demonized and how the strength of Uzbekistan has to come at the expense of those in Nukus.
I think I've spent a lot of my career working not just on Eurasia, but also on failed states. And it's important to understand that a country that's trying to open up sometimes faces a choice, or rather, sometimes faces competing dangers. One of those competing dangers we focused on here, which is the authoritarian impulse in a society which has been run as an authoritarian regime. The other is, as they open up, that democratic passions of the majority can produce new problems with minorities. And how you thread that is not so easy. And so we need to understand that as we look at this specific crisis. Okay, we have a question for the ambassador. Can you provide details or more details on the timeline for constitutional reforms and the process around them?
Sure, absolutely. Actually, everyone acknowledged how the decision to drop those amendments, so regarding the status of Karakalpakstan, was so swift and quick. And in this regard, what I would say that even given the fact that how people in Karakalpakstan in particular reacted to this, as I said before, miscalculation. And at this moment, even I don't rule out so the possibility of introduction completely new amendments or even rescheduling the referendum date in order to give a time for reassessment of all amendments. So at this moment, as you might be aware, so right after these riots in Karakalpakstan, the parliament has made a decision to extend the period for consideration of all those amendments suggested by the public. And currently, so the Constitutional Commission is still collecting them, and hopefully, so they will be thoroughly considered and assessed as well. So the timeline, so the exact timeline for the referendum hasn't been defined yet, but the process is still going on, as I said before.
Thank you. We have a question, let's see, from Alexander Gilliot for Dr. Bertashvili. Is it useful to compare the unrest in Karakalpakstan with the unrest in Kazakhstan in January? Do you see these events as part of some sort of trend, or is it better to imagine them as completely separate events?
Well, I still don't think we know exactly what happened in Kazakhstan. I still don't think we know exactly what's happened in Uzbekistan. So going back to my earlier point is that, you know, the world is seeing the global economic crisis is going to drive protests. And that's why I said Uzbekistan maybe hasn't seen these kinds of protests before, but I think it should brace itself to see more of this in the future. But what is different about this? What is different about this is this was tied to a constitutional issue. These protests became about issues of self-determination and democracy, whereas I would argue that the protests in Kazakhstan were initially about something very different. And so that is why how the government addresses this, because of where they came from. I don't think anybody was anticipating unrest in Nukus, that nobody was anticipating, as far as I knew, these constitutional changes. They were really shocking. That's why they made the headlines in Tashkent when they came out. It was like the one part of the constitutional reforms that really drew attention were these, because they were so shocking and because they seemed to be solving, it was a solution where there was no problem. And the result of that was instigating interethnic conflict where there really hadn't been much at a high level before. And so now Uzbekistan has this problem, and it's tied to the constitution. And I think this is what makes it very, very different. And you know, we'll be watching to see how Tashkent reacts to this.
Okay, thank you. Navbahor, if you also want to take a crack at this question, is there anything to point out similarities or differences between the events in Kazakhstan early this year and then what happened in Nukus?
Happiness with the system. I think that's a common thread, you know, and there are a lot of the region thrives in conspiracy theories, and I have to mention this. And you know, as journalists, we don't really take them seriously, but we constantly hear about them. Whether it's, you know, it's the relations between the countries or any kind of unrest or conflict. So remember what happened, what kind of conspiracy theories came out of the Kazakhstan unrest, that, you know, Russia's hand, you know, something is happening there, that these outside players, the outforced, let's say, foreign agents, that's what even the Kazakh government still mentions, right? The role of some kind of a alien force controlling the situation or trying to get things out of control. We've been hearing similar statements from the Uzbek officials, including from President Mirziyoyev himself, something that he has not specified yet. We don't know who he's really talking about, but I've been, you know, brainstorming with some analysts in Uzbekistan, and guess who they point to? Of course, Russia, right? Oh, this could be something, you know, the Russia's conspiracy. And this is coming from some serious, you know, circles of people. And what I heard yesterday from two analysts was that, you know, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan have been working very, very closely on Karakalpakstan. Of course, because Kazakhstan is adjacent to Karakalpakstan. And so to maintain stability there, you need to work together. But at the same time, their assessment is that the Kazakh government is trying to dismiss any of those suspicions that anybody in that establishment could have encouraged in some way these separatist Karakalpaks who have bases in Kazakhstan and by the way in Kyrgyzstan as well, because this is, the Karakalpak separatism has a long history, and we don't have to get into this right now, but some of these activists have actually already fled Uzbekistan, and many of them live several of them live in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. So the theories that, some people in Tashkent are building around them is that, well, they have some support from these establishments. So the fact that President Tokayev and Mirziyoyev are working closely now, they see as an indication that the Kazakh government knows about this suspicion and that they're trying to sort of like come out clean, or demonstrate that they have nothing to do with this. So
Okay.
I mean, that's one angle I think that's really interesting, even though it's very speculative, that we also see on social media that a lot of people focus on.
Okay, that's got to be the last word. We're already over time. Let me just make the final point before I thank you all for joining us. I think it would be very dangerous for any country in Central Asia to play with separatist movements. We see what the big brother to the north is doing with separatist movements in its neighborhood. So with that, I'd like to thank our participants for joining us for this very, very enlightening conversation. And thank you to our audience, especially those who joined in to help provide vital information.
Thank you.